The gavel hadn't even fallen yet when my brother pointed his finger at me in front of 12 strangers and said the words that would end our family the way we knew it. She never served a day in the military. If she says she did, she's lying to this jury just like she lied to our father. I sat there in a gray suit, no pins, no ribbons, nothing that would tell anyone in that courtroom who I actually was. I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for my lawyer's arm. I just watched Daniel's face flushed with the particular confidence of a man who has never once been told no, and believed it. He thought silence was surrender. He was about to learn otherwise. My name is Jessica Reynolds. I'm 42 years old, and until 6 months ago my brother and I hadn't spent more than an hour together in the same room since our mother's funeral. That morning in the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, he stood in front of the jury box in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage and told them I had spent 20 years inventing a career to manipulate a dying man out of his fortune. The accusation was specific, and it was designed to be devastating. He said I'd been absent for most of my adult life. He said the family never knew where I was stationed, never met a commanding officer, never saw a single photograph of me in uniform. He said I told people I worked for the government but never explained what that meant, and that after our father died, my name turned up in a sealed appendix to his trust, an appendix that authorized the transfer of more than $800,000 out of the estate just 3 days before he passed. Daniel looked at me like a man who already knew he'd won. He believed correctly that almost none of my service record existed anywhere he could find it. What he didn't understand was why. The story the jury was hearing that morning had actually started 6 months earlier on a gray afternoon at Fort Belvoir, when my phone rang during a briefing, and a voice I didn't recognize told me my father was gone. I flew back to Virginia within the day. Daniel met me at the house we grew up in, and instead of asking how I was holding up, he looked at his watch and said, "You made it just in time for the will reading. Convenient." At the reading, our father's attorney explained that Daniel and I were named as co-beneficiaries of the trust, but that Daniel had been granted temporary control as executor. Buried in the language was a clause that stood out to me immediately, a clause stating I would receive the family house and a significant share of the estate if I could provide evidence of what our father called service duty known to Robert Reynolds. Daniel laughed out loud when the attorney read it. "Service duty. She's a paper pusher for the government." I said nothing. I understood in that moment exactly what my father had done. He'd written the clause deliberately vague, protecting the parts of my record that weren't mine to reveal while leaving a door open for the day someone tried to use my silence against me. He knew that day was coming. He knew it would be Daniel. Within weeks, Daniel filed suit. The complaint accused me of fabricating my military record, manipulating a dying man, embezzling funds from the trust, and forging a signature on the trust appendix. Reading it, I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. This wasn't about money. Money was only the excuse. I called my attorney Eleanor Price, a former JAG lawyer, who had spent 3 decades reading between the lines of exactly this kind of case. I told her what I was starting to understand. "He doesn't just want the money," I said. "He wants to erase who I am." Eleanor didn't look surprised. She'd read the filing twice before I called. "Then let him talk," she said. "Let him say everything he wants to say on the record under oath before we show anyone a single piece of the truth." I asked her why we would wait. Every instinct I'd trained into myself over 20 years told me to correct the record immediately, to shut the accusation down before it spread any further into our extended family, our father's old friends, the community that had known us since we were children. Eleanor shook her head. "Because right now, he's building his entire case on a lie he thinks is unbreakable. If you correct him too early, he adjusts the lie. Let him commit to it in front of a jury under oath on the record. Let him say it enough times that there's no way to walk it back later." I thought about my father, about the vague language in that appendix, about the years I'd spent unable to explain to my own family where I'd been, or what I'd carried home with me. I thought about how easy it had been for Daniel to fill that silence with whatever story served him best. So I made a decision that morning in the courthouse hallway, watching my brother shake hands with reporters like a man already accepting a trophy. I wasn't going to hand over my record. Not yet. I was going to let him build his entire case brick by brick on top of a lie, and then I was going to watch it collapse under him with no one to blame but himself. To understand why Daniel stood in that courtroom so certain of himself, you have to understand the house we grew up in, and the two very different children who came out of it. Daniel was always the one people noticed first. He was captain of the football team in high school, the kind of easy, confident boy who filled a room without trying. He went on to a well-regarded business school, and every holiday dinner for years afterward came with an update on some new achievement, some new title, some new reason for the table to turn toward him. When he got into trouble, and he did more than once, our mother was always the first to explain it away. I was the quiet one. I liked running with my father before sunrise, learning to read topographic maps at the kitchen table, fixing the old Jeep in the garage instead of going to parties. After our mother died of cancer when I was 17, something between my father and me shifted into a kind of understanding that didn't need many words. He wasn't a man who said, "I love you," easily. But he showed up. Every time I needed him to, he showed up. When I told the family I'd enrolled in ROTC, Daniel didn't hide his opinion. "You won't last 3 months," he said. "You hate being told what to do." I didn't argue with him. I finished the program, got commissioned as a second lieutenant, and started a career that would take me further from that house than either of us expected. For most of the years that followed, I could tell my family very little about where I actually was. Officially, I told them I handled logistics analysis for the Department of Defense. It was true in the way that a locked door is technically a wall accurate, but built to keep people out for a reason. Daniel decided early on that this meant I had an unremarkable desk job, and he never let an opportunity pass to remind me of it. He commented on my modest salary at every family gathering. He asked when I was going to get a real house. He treated my single itinerant life as proof that I'd chosen a lesser path than his. Our father never made that mistake. He'd been an officer himself long enough to recognize the shape of the gaps in what I told him. One night after I came home from an assignment that had lasted longer than any of them wanted to acknowledge, he saw the scar on my shoulder while I was reaching for a coffee mug. He didn't ask where it came from. He just said quietly, "You don't have to tell me. I only need to know you brought your people home." "Not all of them," I said. That was the first time he hugged me since I'd become an adult. I remember the smell of his sweater, the particular stiffness in his arms, like a man unused to the gesture but unwilling to let the moment pass without it. Years later, Daniel began investing in a string of increasingly risky commercial real estate projects. He borrowed heavily mortgaged properties he didn't fully own, and quietly used our father's name to co-sign several loans without asking permission. When our father found out, he removed Daniel from direct control of part of the family assets. Daniel decided without any evidence that I had convinced him to do it. The truth is, I didn't learn about any of it until after our father's funeral. I wasn't consulted. I wasn't even in the country when it happened. But Daniel needed someone to blame, and I was conveniently unavailable to defend myself in real time. So he started talking. To cousins, to old family friends, to anyone who would listen at a holiday table. He said I wasn't really in the military. He said I was a civilian contractor dressing up a boring job in secrecy to win our father's sympathy. He said I was circling the estate waiting for my inheritance. Each version got a little more specific, a little more convincing, because no one ever contradicted him. I couldn't. Most of what I would have needed to say to correct him was classified, and even the parts that weren't felt like handing him ammunition, he'd only twist into something worse. My silence, which had always been a discipline I was proud of, became the exact weapon he needed. It was Eleanor who found the detail that told me how far he was willing to go. During discovery, she learned that Daniel had hired a private investigator months before filing suit specifically to search for my military record. The investigator came back with almost nothing. No public deployment records, no promotion ceremony photographs, no news articles mentioning my name, no visible awards. To a man looking for confirmation of what he already believed, an absence of evidence looked exactly like evidence of absence. I read the investigator's report Eleanor had obtained and felt something close to sad amusement. "He couldn't find my file," I said, "so he decided I don't exist." Eleanor smiled the way she did when she already knew how a case was going to end. "And that," she said, "is going to be the most expensive mistake of his life." During discovery, Daniel's legal team produced bank records showing that $800,000 had been transferred out of our father's trust 3 days before he died. The recipient was an organization called the Sentinel Recovery Foundation. Daniel told the extended family and eventually the jury that Sentinel was a shell entity I secretly controlled. "She didn't need to take the whole estate," he said. "She just needed to move it in pieces and hide behind the name of a charity. I knew exactly what Sentinel was. I said nothing about it in front of him. It was a foundation that supported the families of service members killed during a campaign I'd been part of years earlier. The recipient list kept confidential to protect the identities and safety of the families involved. My father had chosen to fund it after learning that some of the people I'd served alongside hadn't received the support they needed when they came home. He never told me he'd done it. I only found out reading the transfer records myself. But there was a problem, and it was a real one. The electronic signature authorizing the transfer bore my name. Eleanor's face changed when she saw it. I told her flatly that I hadn't signed anything. She believed me, but belief wasn't going to be enough in front of a jury. A forensic analyst she brought in traced the digital signature back to the computer in my father's home office. The login used belonged to a secondary account, one that had been issued to Daniel years earlier, back when he was managing our father's medical billing during a hospitalization. I started to see the shape of what he'd actually done. Daniel hadn't stolen from Sentinel. He'd moved the $800,000 in, then submitted falsified paperwork, claiming the transfer had been made in error and requesting a refund. The refunded amount was then split across 3 limited liability companies, all tied back to Daniel. What he hadn't counted on was that Sentinel operated under Department of Defense audit standards. Every transaction left a trail time-stamped and cross-referenced the kind of paperwork trail that a man used to moving money through private real estate deals had simply never had to think about before. Eleanor wanted to bring the evidence forward immediately. I told her to wait. "We don't know yet what else he did to our father," I said. A search through my father's personal files turned up something Eleanor almost missed: a handwritten letter dated 2 months before his death. It read, "If Daniel sues his sister, open the blue appendix." There was no blue appendix in the version of the will Daniel had submitted to the court. Eleanor and I went to the bank to check my father's safe deposit box. It had already been opened one day after the funeral under a power of attorney Daniel held. Inside, all that remained was one of my father's old service medals and a photograph of me as a young officer candidate taken the day I was commissioned. Daniel had taken the appendix. There was no other explanation. Around the same time, Daniel gave a sworn deposition. Under oath, he claimed he had never accessed our father's accounts, had no knowledge of Sentinel, had never seen a blue appendix, and had no significant personal debt. Every single statement was false, and every single one was now permanently on the record in his own words under penalty of perjury. I understood watching the transcript exactly what Eleanor had been doing all along. She hadn't just let Daniel talk in court. She'd made sure he talked under oath on paper in a deposition he couldn't later reframe or soften. He'd been building a wall of lies and calling it a foundation. Eleanor laid 4 printed depositions on the conference table in front of me. "Now he's not just facing a losing lawsuit," she said. "He's facing the possibility of losing his freedom." I looked at the photograph from the safe deposit box, the young woman in it, barely recognizable to me now, and thought about how much my father must have suspected even then about what his son was capable of. "Not yet," I said. "I still want to know what he was trying to warn me about." I found Martha Cole through my father's home health agency. She'd been his nurse for the last 8 months of his life, and when I called her, she agreed to meet me at a diner outside Alexandria, choosing a booth in the back, where she could keep her voice low. She told me Daniel came by most evenings during those final months, and that the visits rarely looked like a son comforting his father. He came with folders. He pressed my father to sign things, and when my father refused or asked too many questions, Daniel's voice would rise until Martha had to find a reason to step back into the room. "Your father said something to me once that I never forgot," Martha told me. "He said, 'My son thinks the estate is a reward for carrying the family name. He never understood that the name is a responsibility.'" Martha admitted she'd started quietly recording some of the arguments, worried she was witnessing something closer to financial elder abuse than a family disagreement. She played one of the recordings for me on her phone, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed play. Daniel's voice came through first sharp and impatient. "If you leave the house to Jessica, I'll prove she's a fraud. Nobody knows what she's actually been doing for 20 years. My father's response was slower, weaker than I remembered his voice ever sounding. "I know. She was never in the military," Daniel pressed. "She just tells people stories about secret missions, so you'll feel proud of her." There was a long pause on the recording before my father answered. "She stays quiet because she swore an oath to stay quiet. You talk too much because you've never had anything worth protecting." The recording alone wouldn't be enough to prove my service record in a courtroom, but it told me something I hadn't fully let myself believe until that moment. My father had known exactly what Daniel intended to do long before either of us stood in front of a jury. Martha had one more piece. She told me my father had sent a package through a secure courier to a military legal office shortly before he died. Eleanor traced the tracking number and found it had gone to the legal branch at the Pentagon. My father had requested formal confirmation of part of my service record, anticipating that our family would end up in exactly the dispute we were now living through. I sat with that for a long time after Martha left. I thought about the last real conversation I'd had with him weeks before the end, when he was already weak but still sharp enough to ask, "If someday your silence gets used against you, what will you do?" "I'll bear it," I told him. He shook his head, slow but certain. "No, honor doesn't mean letting someone else bury you alive." Back in the present, Eleanor filed a motion asking the court to accept sealed documentation directly from the Department of Defense. The Pentagon agreed to release a limited confirmation enough to establish service record and rank, without exposing missions locations or the identities of anyone I'd served with. Daniel had no idea any of this was happening. As far as he knew, my request had gone nowhere since nothing about my service had appeared yet on the public evidence list. Confident the silence meant victory, he hosted a family dinner and announced to relatives that he expected to win the house outright and force me to cover his legal costs. After the trial, he told the table loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm going to push for an investigation into her for impersonating a service member." An aunt asked me directly in front of everyone whether I had really served. "My father knew the truth was all I said." Daniel laughed. "Dad's dead, he can't save you anymore." I looked at my brother across the table at the confidence sitting so comfortably on his face and felt something settle inside me instead of break. "You're right," I said. "He can't save me." What I didn't say out loud, though I thought it clearly enough to feel it in my chest, was this: he didn't need to save me. He'd already left me everything I needed to save myself. The trial resumed on a Monday morning, and Daniel walked in like a man who'd already been handed the verdict. Tailored suit, a full legal team flanking him, and a hired expert he introduced as a specialist in military records research. The expert took the stand first. He testified with the calm authority of a man reading from a script he believed in that he had found no public deployment records under my name, no ceremony photographs, no news coverage, no publicly listed decorations. "In my professional opinion," he concluded, "there is no reliable evidence the defendant served as an officer in the capacity she claims." Eleanor rose for cross-examination, and I watched the jury lean in slightly the way people do when they sense a shift coming. "Do you have access to classified personnel files?" she asked. "No." "Do you have access to Special Operations Command records?" "No." "Do you currently hold an active federal security clearance?" "No." "So, your conclusion," Eleanor said, letting the words land slowly, "is based on your inability to find something you were never authorized to look for in the first place." The courtroom went quiet in a way that felt different from before. Daniel's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did a small tightening, almost imperceptible, the kind of thing you only notice if you've spent years learning to read people who don't want to be read. Then Daniel took the stand himself. He described in a voice that cracked at exactly the right moments how he'd stayed by our father's side through his final years while I was nowhere to be found. Some of it wasn't entirely false. He had been present often. What he left out was why. He wasn't there out of devotion. He was there because proximity gave him control over our father's finances, and he'd guarded that access the way other men guard a bank vault. He wiped his eyes in front of the jury. "I only wanted to protect my father's legacy from a woman who used lies about the military to win his sympathy." When Eleanor cross-examined him, she asked whether he had ever accessed our father's financial accounts. He said no. She produced the login records tied to his account credentials. He suggested the bank might have made an error. She asked whether he had any connection to the 3 LLCs that received the refunded Sentinel funds. He called it passive investment. She produced the incorporation documents listing him as sole owner. I watched him start to lose his footing, the practiced calm slipping in small increments, a longer pause before answering a glance toward his attorney that lasted half a second too long. And still he believed that if he could just convince the jury I'd lied about my service, none of the financial evidence would matter. People forgive complicated things from someone they trust. They rarely forgive them from someone they've already decided is a fraud. In his closing remarks to the jury, he turned to face them directly one more time. She never served. If she says she did, she's lying. It was the same line he'd opened with, and I understood watching a few jurors' expressions shift that repetition was doing exactly what he intended. Doubt doesn't need proof. It only needs enough repetition to feel familiar. His attorney then turned to me and demanded specifics: my unit, my deployment locations, my commanding officer's name, the nature of my missions, any military honors I'd received. I'm not authorized to disclose some of that information, I answered. How convenient, the attorney said, letting the words hang in the air for the jury to absorb. No, I said, it's never once been convenient. At the end of the day's session, Daniel passed my table on his way out and leaned down, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. You should take the deal while you still have the chance. What deal? I asked. Give up the house, return the money, and admit in writing you were never an officer. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had spent 6 months building an entire case on the assumption that my silence meant I had nothing to defend myself with. Tomorrow, I said, you're going to want to remember exactly what you just asked me to do. He laughed it off and walked away, already rehearsing. I imagined whatever closing statement he planned to give to the reporters he'd started inviting to the courthouse steps. That night, Eleanor called me at home. Her voice had a different edge to it than I'd heard from her before, not worry, but something closer to quiet anticipation. The Pentagon documentation arrived this evening, she said. A sealed courier delivery, authenticated and time-stamped. There's an authorized witness scheduled to appear in court tomorrow morning. I sat in my father's old study for a long time after we hung up, looking at the empty chair behind his desk, at the bookshelves still lined with the field manuals and unit histories he'd collected over 40 years of service. I thought about the blue appendix Daniel had taken from the safe deposit box, about the letter my father had left behind, anticipating exactly this moment, about how carefully he had prepared for a fight he wouldn't be alive to see. Tomorrow, the silence I'd carried for 6 months and in some ways for 20 years was finally going to speak for itself. The courtroom was packed the next morning. Daniel had invited several local reporters, confident he was about to expose what he called his sister's military fraud in front of cameras instead of just a jury. Eleanor stood first before the judge had even finished calling the session to order. The defense wishes to submit a document authenticated by the Department of Defense provided under this court's sealed order. A court security officer stepped forward and handed Eleanor a brown envelope bearing an official federal seal. She carried it directly to Judge Malcolm Hayes. Daniel's attorney objected immediately, calling it theatrical, a last-minute stunt designed to sway the jury. Judge Hayes overruled the objection without raising his voice, reminding the room that the document had already been authenticated through federal channels before the trial resumed that morning. He opened the envelope, he read the first page, and he stopped. I watched something shift across his face, not surprise exactly, but the particular stillness of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the case in front of him. He removed his glasses, looked at me for a long moment, and then turned to the court officer standing near the side door. Everyone please rise. The room stood confused, chairs scraping against the floor in a ragged wave. A side door opened, and Major General Evelyn Brooks entered, authorized by the Department of Defense to appear on the record, accompanied by a military legal counsel. The judge explained, reading from the released portion of the file, that the confirmed record established the following: that I had served continuously for over 20 years in the United States Army, that I currently held the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, that I had held command positions within a unit supporting special operations activity, that the classified nature of my public record existed for legitimate security reasons, that I had been awarded the Silver Star for actions during a rescue operation, and that my refusal to disclose mission details had never constituted deception, but a binding legal obligation. General Brooks testified that I had never once requested that any part of my record be concealed for financial gain. The restrictions on my file had been standing military policy for years, long before our father's trust was ever established. She further confirmed that Sentinel Recovery Foundation was a legitimate organization supporting military families, and that I held no ownership interest in it whatsoever. Eleanor followed with the financial evidence laid out now without interruption. Daniel had used our father's login credentials. Daniel had initiated the transfer. Daniel had submitted the falsified refund request. Daniel had routed the returned funds into companies he solely owned. Daniel had altered the trust appendix to redirect blame onto me. And Daniel had repeated all of it under oath in a sworn deposition that was now part of the permanent record. Then came the final piece. The Department of Defense had retained a copy of the blue appendix submitted alongside our father's original request for record confirmation. In it, my father had written, "Jessica has taken nothing from me. The transfer to Sentinel was a gift I gave willingly in memory of those who did not come home with my daughter." He'd added one more line, one that Eleanor read aloud to the entire courtroom. "If Daniel ever attempts to use Jessica's service to humiliate her, all trust authority currently held by Daniel is to be terminated immediately." Daniel's face drained of color. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering something I couldn't hear, but I could read the shape of it well enough. He hadn't known a copy existed. Judge Hayes looked directly at him. "Mr. Reynolds, do you still wish to maintain under oath that your sister never served?" Daniel didn't answer right away. The judge reminded him he remained under oath. "I may have," Daniel finally said, "misunderstood some things." I looked at my brother for the first time all trial, without flinching, without softening anything in my expression. "No," I said. "You didn't misunderstand. You knew you had no proof. You just believed I wouldn't be able to defend myself." Judge Hayes ordered the full record transferred to federal prosecutors for review, perjury, financial fraud, forgery of trust documents, financial exploitation of an elderly person, and obstruction of justice. Court security asked Daniel to remain in the courtroom after the jury was dismissed. He sat there alone at his table, the reporters he'd invited now, typing furiously about an entirely different story than the one he'd promised them. The jury rejected every claim Daniel had brought against me and confirmed that I had taken nothing from the estate that wasn't legally and rightfully mine. The court transferred control of the trust to an independent fiduciary, recognized me as the lawful owner of the family home, and ordered Daniel to cover the majority of the legal costs from the case. The 3 LLCs tied to the Sentinel refund had their assets frozen pending full financial restitution. A few months later, Daniel accepted a plea agreement with federal prosecutors. He avoided the maximum sentence, but the terms weren't gentle. He was required to repay the stolen funds in full, submit to a period of federal supervision, sell both his vacation property and the luxury car he'd financed against our father's name, and issue a public acknowledgement that he had knowingly provided false testimony under oath. He called me once, not long after the plea was finalized. I almost didn't answer. "You destroyed my life," he said, his voice flat in a way I hadn't heard from him before. "I didn't log into Dad's accounts," I said. "I didn't forge any documents. I didn't lie to a jury. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences of what you did yourself." He asked why I hadn't just told the truth from the beginning, why I'd let it drag out for months instead of ending it in a single afternoon. "Because if I'd proven who I was on day one, you would have changed your story," I said. "I needed you to say every lie out loud while you still believed I couldn't answer back." There was a long silence on the line before he hung up. I didn't call him again, and he didn't call me. I moved back into our father's house, though I didn't try to preserve it like a museum the way some people do with a childhood home. I turned his old study into an office for a support program I started for veterans and military families, navigating exactly the kind of financial and legal fights I'd just come through myself. Part of the trust, once it was properly restored, went legitimately to Sentinel exactly the way my father had always intended. On one of the last afternoons before the house officially became mine on paper, I found myself standing in the garage looking at the old Jeep my father and I used to work on together when I was a teenager. It hadn't run in years. On the driver's seat, someone my father before he died had left a small envelope. Inside was a single line written in his handwriting, the same steady hand I remembered from every letter he'd ever sent me overseas. You don't have to prove who you are to the people who love you, but never let a liar define you to the rest of the world. I folded the letter and stood there for a while in the quiet of that garage, breathing in the smell of old motor oil and dust, feeling something settle in my chest that wasn't triumph. It wasn't really about Daniel losing. It was relief that my father's name and the names of the people I'd served with people who never made it home weren't going to be used as props in somebody else's lie anymore. My brother walked into that courtroom believing my silence was proof that I was weak. He was wrong. My silence was never weakness. It was simply the time I gave him to talk his way into a verdict he couldn't walk back from. I think about that a lot these days, how the people who underestimate quiet strength usually do it because they've never had to build any of their own. Daniel needed applause to feel real. I never did. And in the end, it wasn't a courtroom full of strangers that proved who I was. It was the truth, patient and steady, doing exactly what it does when you finally let it speak. If you made it this far with me, I want to know what you think happens to families like mine after everything falls apart. Do you think Daniel and I will ever speak again? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe. I'd hate for you to miss a single moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.